Okay, I wanted to go over chapter 5 lipids due to us missing class for the snow. I also, this Thursday, will not be in class. You will have a substitute. She taught this course last semester. I just want to make sure that you have all the materials that you need. I've talked about before how lipids can be a little bit confusing, especially if you haven't learned about molecules before. So I'm just going to go through the entire PowerPoint. Keep in mind, you also have the student version. So I will not only post this recording, but I will also post the PowerPoint that I'm going over today that will fill in those blank spots. Okay. So to start off, I have a short video for you. I'm not going to play it, but on slide 1, I do suggest watching this video. It'll just go over, what makes something a fat. So when we're talking about the molecule fat, what does that molecule need to have in order for it to be considered a fat or considered a lipid? Today, I'm going to go over the types of fatty acids, including saturated, unsaturated, and trans. Major lipids, including phospholipids, triglycerides, and sterols. And then also just the process of these molecules. So less about the anatomy of them, but more now about the physiology. So how are they moving through our system? How do we get them into our body? How do we transport them throughout our body to the places that need them? And then I also just want to talk about the implications that those things have for our health. So just a really quick tip is that when I talk about fatty acids, a fatty acid is a component to a lipid, especially triglycerides. So we're really going to focus on triglycerides. We're going to break up the different types of fatty acids that can be inside of a triglyceride. And then just a few announcements. So due this Sunday, the 26th, so this will be a week from today, you have activity 7. And then due in the next couple weeks, you have activity 8, discussion 2, and replies. You are having a guest presenter on the 2nd. So just keep that in mind, is that I will not be in attendance. I will be on a trip with my family. So please ask questions ahead of time. Do not wait to do the assignments until Sunday, especially our discussion 2 post. It's going to be pretty big. I'm going to come back and go through discussion 2 at the end of the lecture today because it is a big assignment. Even though you're not writing a lot, remember you have to find references that are peer reviewed and you have to cite them. So I'm not just looking for references and citations inside of the discussion post. I'm also looking for them inside of all of the replies. Okay, so I'll come back and do that at the end. So first, let's talk about what makes something a fat or a lipid. When I'm talking about the molecule lipid, I mean the same thing as a fat. So they can be used interchangeably. Fats are one type of lipid, and then lipids are a diverse class of molecules that are insoluble in water. So that is a characteristic that makes them a lipid. They are insoluble in water. Lipids or fats are never going to dissolve. So that's what that means. Insoluble means it does not dissolve in water. So for example, if you have oil is a type of fat, and water, and you mix them or agitate them, you are going to have them separate back out. So they do not mix together. Remember, we've talked about before how like has to dissolve like. And so that's why we have bile, for example, being created by the liver, stored in the gallbladder, and then secreted through our common bile duct in our small intestine in order to emulsify those fats. We cannot dissolve them and absorb them in a way that we, for example, absorb our water-soluble vitamins or minerals. We have to absorb them in a separate way. There are 3 different types of lipids that are found in foods. There are triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. All of them are going to contain fatty acids. fatty acids are a component of all three types of these lipids. So there are specific words that we can see inside of these molecule names that'll help you understand how they look. So if I think about a triglyceride, tri means three in Latin, and so that's going to have three fatty acid tails. Phospholipids are going to have a phosphate head, and then sterols, we'll talk a little bit about them at the end. But you can see, even if you forget the name, knowing the Latin prefixes really help you understand what that molecule looks like. So what is a fatty acid? Remember, a fatty acid is a component to all of our three types of lipids. It's going to be a building block, so it's going to be a part of it. It contains a long hydrocarbon chain and then a carboxylic acid head. So those are really important. All this means is that we have these carbons surrounded by hydrogens. And then at the head, this group right here is just called a carboxylic acid. You don't necessarily need to know, like, to be able to draw them like you would in organic chemistry, but I would just know that these two things are what make up a fatty acid. Now, when we're thinking about how the molecule interacts in our body, it's important to know that the long hydrocarbon chain is going to be hydrophobic. So what that means is it's afraid of water, right? It's not going to dissolve in water. And then our hydrophilic head, it likes water, right? So it can dissolve in water. So how it orients itself is dependent on kind of where the water is. So this is what our three major types of lipids look like. So you can see our phospholipids have two fatty acid tails. Our triglycerides have three fatty acid tails. Remember, tri means three. And then we have sterols. Sterols are a little bit different. They are going to contain rings. So you can see that here. A sterol is a type of molecule that contains rings like that. If I break down a triglycerides, remember, I'm going to get those fatty acid tails and a glycerol head. And then there can be many different types of fatty acids. So remember, now I'm looking more deep into those fatty acids. And there are three different kinds we're going to break down in the first 20 minutes or so of this presentation. So there are saturated fatty acids that are rigid. They look like this. There's monosaturated fatty acids, and then there's polyunsaturated fatty acids. So the molecule, what it looks like, what types of bonds it has certain implications to our health because of how it interacts with our body. So I just want you to note really quickly that a saturated fatty acid is very straight. A monounsaturated fatty acid is going to have a kink, and then a polyunsaturated fatty acid can have several kinks in it. So now we're going to break them all down. Remember that each kind of them are fatty acids, and fatty acids are found inside of our triglycerides. And then we have three different types of fats that we're going to talk about, or lipids we're going to talk about: phospholipids, triglycerides, and sterols. So now let's look closely at these three different types. A good example is kind of thinking about butter and oil. So what is the difference between a saturated and an unsaturated fatty acid? And I have a meme up here for you. So butter, oh, you mean saturated lipids. People will say, oh, you know, fat's really bad for you. But what does that mean? What are they actually talking about? You know, there are certain fats that maybe don't interact the best with our body, and there's others that are essential for our health. So understanding the molecule, what it looks like, and what it does in our blood is essential. It all has to do with something called saturation. All right, so if I go back to these molecules, and especially just what a fatty acid tail looks like, right? And remember, it looks like this. It has a long hydrocarbon chain. I want you to see that they are saturated with hydrogens. Okay, so when I say the word saturated, that just means that it has hydrogens. So always think of it from the perspective of saturated with hydrogens. Okay. So a saturated bond is going to be saturated with the hydrogens, and an unsaturated bond, instead of having these extra hydrogens here, the two carbons are going to make a double bond. Okay, so they're opposite. If something is saturated with hydrogens, they are not going to have double bonds because they have the hydrogens instead to maintain their electromagnetism in a way that's different than the double bonds. Okay, so if we count all the bonds that we need to make this carbon molecule stable, if we look at it from the saturated version, we have 1 bond, 2 bond, 3 bond, and then the 4th bond is to that other carbon. Now, if I count it from the unsaturated or double bonds, I have the same amount of bonding. So that carbon molecule is still going to be the same. So what's going to happen is we just get rid of one of the hydrogens, and that carbon is going to struggle to maintain its balance, and it's going to create a double bond with that carbon. So what this means is that saturated fatty acids have hydrocarbon atoms surrounding every carbon in the chain. They do not contain double bonds. They are saturated with hydrogens. Unsaturated fatty acids, or you'll see them labeled MUFAs, lack hydrogen atoms in only one region. How do you know it's one region? Because of the word mono. So remember, those Latin prefixes are really important for you to understand what these words mean. They are just going to contain one double bond, right? So the word unsaturated just means they're not saturated with a hydrogen, right? A polyunsaturated fatty acid, or a PUFA, is going to lack hydrogen atoms on multiple locations. So they contain more than one double bond, okay? So if we look at something that is saturated, it's going to be straight. And then every time that we get that double bond, we are going to get a kink in the molecule. And that's really important because the kink is going to react differently with our blood in our vessels than something that is very straight and rigid, like a saturated fatty acid. And you can see that here. So you see these long hydrocarbon chains, and every single time that you have that double bond, you get a kink. So if I look at my polyunsaturated, so there's many double bonds, you keep on having these kinks. And there's specific ways to name these molecules. It is really interesting. There's very specific ways that molecules that we have, and it all depends on where the kinks are, but we don't really need to know any of that. I just want you to notice that one is going to be straight, and then others are going to be kinked. The more double bonds it has, the less saturated it is, because the less hydrogens it has, because it's going to be forced to create that double bond. So what you have now are either these straight fatty acids or these bent fatty acids. Let's look at the saturated fatty acids first. So because there's no kinks, they can be packed very tightly together, and they are solid at room temperature. So a great example of this is butter. You can see these straight hydrocarbon chains here. Long chains like this are going to, again, lack those kinks, and because they lack those kinks, they can be stacked very quickly, and they're much more stable. Because they're stable, heat isn't going to affect them as much, which is why they are solid at room temperature. Anything that is going to come from an animal, so meats, dairies, lard, for example, are going to be high in saturated fatty acids, no matter what. No matter if you change them. There's also a couple exceptions to this rule. So all animal fats are going to have saturated fatty acids, but there's also some vegetables that contain fatty or saturated fats as well. These include some of our topical oils. So coconut, palm kernel oil. Think about, if you've ever seen a jar of coconut oil in the grocery store, it is going to be solid at room temperature. It is a saturated fatty acid. And you can already start to see the confusion that the field of nutrition has, right? You, I'm sure, have been told, that butter isn't good for you, but then, olive oil or, coconut oil can be put all over your body and it's fine, right? You can eat it. People I know have eaten it with like spoonfuls, but they're both saturated fatty acids. Doesn't mean they're bad or good. It just means that they're saturated. They don't have double bonds. Because of that, they don't have kinks and they can be stacked very closely together. Now, we do know that because of how they stack and they're very stable, they do increase the risk for heart disease. They do this because they elevate blood cholesterol. And we'll talk a little bit about cholesterol, what that means, what a lipoprotein is, why is it that we don't want high cholesterol in our body. But it's important to know whether or not you're getting it from butter or coconut oil. They're both saturated acids, and they are going to increase your risk for heart disease. So we talked about unsaturated fatty acids. Now we're going to, or saturated, now we're going to go into unsaturated. So remember, an unsaturated fatty acid is going to be liquid at room temperature. Mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids do not stack well together because they are bent. Whether or not they come from different plants or different sources, that's going to be what that molecule looks like. Because they have kinks, they don't pack pack tightly together. They're going to be present in mostly plant oils. And then remember, we have this difference of monosaturated and polyunsaturated. So there are specific oils that contain them. So for monounsaturated, I want you to think olive, canola, peanut oils. I had someone come up and ask me about cooking with oil. And think about, canola oil is very cheap. It's very affordable, and it's a great source of unsaturated fatty acids. They do not contain a large amount of saturated fatty acids, and so it's a great thing to cook with. There is a fad right now where people won't use any oil to cook food. It's up to you, but these things are essential for our health. We do need to eat lipids. And then polyunsaturated, I want you to think corn oil, sunflower oil, safflower oils are going to be sources of these oils. And then also our fish, flax, and walnut oils are important sources. These oils are going to be more expensive. And so, I know people that'll just, maybe snack on a couple walnuts, or they will put some flaxseed in their protein smoothie, or maybe have it in a salad. All of that is great. It doesn't necessarily matter if you're getting it from an oil or from a whole food, just that you're getting it. These are going to have the opposite effect. So where saturated fatty acids increase our chances of heart disease, unsaturated fatty acids are going to lower our blood cholesterol, which is really important, and why knowing where to get them is so essential. Here's a great diagram you will see in your book on page 165. So you can see all the different types of sources, how much saturated fatty acids, monounsaturated, and then polyunsaturated oils they contain. So most of them are going to be combinations. So if we look at something like shortening or margarine, they contain a little bit of each thing. Other things like coconut oil are going to be mostly saturated fatty acids. I always think it's interesting because we attack butter, but palm oil or coconut oil just contains as many saturated fatty acids. In fact, butter contains some monounsaturated fatty acids in comparison to coconut oil that doesn't contain any. So it is important just to keep these in mind. It's not as straightforward as you would think. Most of these sources are going to have a combination of oils. Okay. So those are just the two differences, right? Is saturated, unsaturated. There's also essential fatty acids. So just when I talked about our essential vitamins and minerals, what I mean by that word essential is that we have to get them from our food sources. We do not manufacture them in our body. And because of that, it's really, really important to educate the public on these things, because they can really impact our health. When we're talking about essential fatty acids, we're talking about developmental delays. We're talking about impacts to the brain, impacts to our nervous system. So the body cannot make them. They must be obtained from our diet. And I'm going to be talking about two different ones. I'm just going to pop up here. So there is omega-6 or linoleic acid. You'll see it abbreviated as LA. Even though it is essential, we think about it as being pro-inflammatory. And then there's a subdivision called arachidonic acid, so AA. When we think about things being pro-inflammatory, we think that they're not good. We absolutely can have too much inflammation in our body. A lot about, how our world works now and our food environment and our health environment. Many of us have too much inflammation in our body, but remember that process of inflammation is really important to heal, right? So our body gets inflamed because, say we have an infection somewhere and we need to pump blood to it. We need to raise our temperature. We need to get, all of our white blood cells there, our macrophages, all of that is good, right? We just don't want that to happen too much, right? If it happens too much, then you get something like, maybe you have, an intense allergic reaction that's going to be an immune reaction that's not going to be great, right? So we're constantly balancing the omega-6s and the omega-3s, right? So pro-inflammatory can be good. We just need it in balance, right? Like everything else. The second type of essential fatty acid is called omega-3s or alpha linoleic acid, ALA. This is going to be anti-inflammatory, and there's two different types, EPA and DHA. So you can see I have a scale here. We really want them in balance. We don't want too much inflammatory responses, but we also need a little bit. So when we're looking at omega-6 in particular, or AA, we are thinking about blood clotting, inflammation like fever responses, and increase in blood pressure. Why would we increase blood pressure? So that our body is pumping that blood to where it needs to go. Because our cardiovascular system, our blood is transport. And so if we don't get the things that our body needs in that area to heal, it's not going to heal. So it's very important that we have that immune response. For omega-3s, I'm going to just break up EPA and DHA. So when I'm looking at EPA, again, it's going to be anti-inflammatory. It's going to block the conversion of AA, so omega-6s, to inflammatory compounds. And it's going to actually work in a similar way to corticosteroids. That's why, for example, if I have someone in the hospital who is on something we call chronic steroid use, we don't want them to be supplementing with EPA because it will kind of give them too much anti-inflammatory properties. So it might reduce their blood clotting. And we just don't want them to be using those supplements, especially if we don't know how much the supplement contains, or it hasn't been FDA tested. For DHA, we're looking more at the things I talked about in the beginning, so fetal development. DHA is also a lot larger of a molecule, so it's going to take up more space in general. It also improves the fluidity of cell membranes. So, we talked about this idea of anti-inflammation. I want you to think about, vitamin K as well when we're talking about this. Vitamin K will help us with our blood clotting, but we also have a lot of medications where we don't want our blood to clot, especially if we have cardiovascular diseases. And so these things work in a similar way, right? Is that DHA is going to improve the fluidity of those cell membranes. It's also good for rotation of vision and nerve signal receptors. So has a lot to do again with development and the nervous system. We know that someone is not getting enough of these things if we have like tingling in the hands, for example. Okay, so now omega-6s can be found in vegetable oils and seeds. And then omega-3s, we think about soy and canola oils, walnuts, flax, green leafy vegetables. So a lot of these are also where we find vitamin K. especially walnuts. So one of the best and I would say cheapest sources of omega-3s are going to be walnuts in particular. For EPA and DHA specifically, they are always going to be converted from a plant source of alpha linoleic acid or directly from a cold water fish. So sardines, wild salmon, trout, and herring. A lot of people that are vegetarian and vegan do not get enough of these because of how they're found in, a lot of fish species. And, if you are a vegetarian or vegan, you're not going to eat fish. And so we want them to get it from those plant sources. We recommend eating fish or more broadly, something with EPA or DHA in it at least 2 times a week. So something that is a good source at least 2 times a week. Really, that just calculates down to just 5% of total kilocalories, which is equal to 2 to 4 tablespoons of plant oils a day, which is not a lot, right? So even though it's essential, it is just a little bit that we need. Even though it's such a little bit, most people do not get enough. In fact, there was a recent meta-analysis that came out that suggests that low intake of omega-3s was more associated with overall mortality, all-cause mortality in comparison to smoking. So we are just now starting to learn about how not getting enough of these things can impact our health. And you can think back again, right? We know they're unsaturated fatty acids. You can think about what they do to our cardiovascular system. They are going to decrease our risk of cardiovascular disease because of those kinks and how it's going through our blood. So you can really start to see how it might just be more essential to our health. Okay, so we talked about saturated, we talked about unsaturated, we talked about our omega-3s and 6s, which are our essential fatty acids. Now I want to talk about something called trans fatty acids. So what happens with trans fatty acids is it's actually the hydrogenation of a plant oil. So remember, all the things that are saturated for the most part are going to come from an animal product. And all the things that are unsaturated are going to have those kinks. So what happens is we're going to take something that is hydrogenated and put hydrogens on it to change the molecular structure. So it really is the process of forcing these hydrogen bonds onto a double bond, and it makes the oil more solid. And you can give yourself a second and think, why? Why is that? It has a lot to do, again, with the fact that there are no kinks. So here we have our saturated fatty acid. And now we are going to force, right? Take something that is trans, right? So this is an example of these molecules. Now we're going to force these hydrogens on here. So that's kind of what happens there. So again, if we take a trans fatty acid, it's going to look like this. And you're forcing those hydrogen bonds on there. And because it's not kinked anymore, it's more stable. It is going to have an impact similar to a saturated fatty acid. So it's not kinked, they're going to stack well together. And because of that, it's much easier for them to build up in our cardiovascular system. So anytime you see that word, hydrogenated, that is going to be a trans fatty acid, because the process of making a trans fatty acids is hydrogenation of a plant oil. So you are taking these molecules and you are forcing hydrogen bonds back on them. You can tell if a food has them in there because you'll see something like partially hydrogenated oil in the ingredients. It's required on the nutrition facts panel, but as we know, our laws regarding nutrition panels aren't super awesome. And so they don't actually have to report it in the nutrition label unless it's more than 2% by weight of that food. So that's very unfortunate as well. So all the foods that have hydrogenated oils are really going to be fast foods, have a lot, and then also baked goods. So they really maintain that kind of moist texture that you want in like a Danish or a pastry or a donut. That is going to be a really big source of our trans fatty acids. Same things with crackers and then some tub margarines. So again, you think, oh, well, butter is bad for you, and so instead I'm going to eat margarine. But again, you know now that saturated foods are going to be solid at room temperature. It doesn't matter if it's from an animal or a plant product, it's still going to look the same. And then we know that specifically trans fats are going to be a hydrogenation of a plant-based oil, which is why margarine, even though it's from a plant, right? It's not from an animal, it's going to be solid at room temperature. So here's an example of what I was talking about before. You see over here on the nutrition label that there's 0% trans fatty acids inside of this product. But then if you look underneath contains 2% or less, you'll see partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil. So they'll say that there's no trans fatty acids, but a lot of times it's a lie. Pretty much anything from a fast food restaurant, especially a baked item like a hamburger bun, or from like the bakery section of a grocery store, are going to contain those trans fatty acids. So about 40% of our sources of trans fat are going to be from that aisle in the grocery store. Margarine is also a huge percent, which is really unfortunate. Back when we were kind of afraid of fat, it was, in the late 1900s, we really had a scare with butter. And so everyone switched over to margarine, but then they started intaking a bunch of trans fats, which is very detrimental to your health. Also, animal products are going to contain them, and then you can see the other sources here in this pie chart that you can pause if you want to look at it longer. Okay, so there are a lot of confusing health recommendations when it comes to nutrition, but one of the things that we know for sure is that we really want to try to eat the least amount of trans fats as we can. They are detrimental to our health. They change the way that our cell membranes function. And they also reduce the removal of bad cholesterol from the blood. So we'll talk about cholesterol later on, but again, LDL, so low density lipoproteins, are going to be bad. And so they are going to reduce the way that we can remove them. Just ignore that. That'll be your attendance activity. So let's pause just for a moment, and I want you to look at this concept map. So we are talking about lipids. We have these 3 different types of lipids. I showed you the different molecules, right? So triglycerides, phospholipids, sterols. Then we took a second and we really dived into the types of fatty acids. So fatty acids are a part of our phospholipids and triglycerides. Triglycerides have 3 fatty acids, and they are broken down into saturated and unsaturated. Something is saturated when it does not have double bonds, or it is saturated with those hydrogen bonds that make up those 4 bonding spots for that carbon atom. And then for unsaturated, we have monounsaturated, 1 double bond, or polyunsaturated, 2 or more double bonds. If we then break down our polyunsaturated into our 2 kinds, we get our essential fatty acids, or our omega-3s and our omega-6s. I think that this concept map, being able to draw this and really understand the differences in the molecules and how the shapes of the molecules impact our health in different ways because of how they function, I think that's the most important way to study for this chapter. So again, fatty acids are also in phospholipids, but we really think of them in triglycerides because there's 3 of them, and triglycerides do a whole bunch of things in our body, where phospholipids are really going to just maintain cell membranes. So if you remember from biology, we have our lipid bilayer and cell membranes. Those are all going to be made from our phospholipids. Triglycerides are kind of the worker fats of the human body, which is where they can get complicated. Sterols are going to be our cholesterols. And so we'll talk about them later on when we think about LDL, HDL, how things are moving around in our body. And then we'll also talk about a couple different types of hormones that require a steroid or fat action, bile, and then vitamin D. All right. So I love this slide as well. You can see the different types of fatty acids, the different molecules, the example of sources, and then the health impacts. It also is great to see just the difference between saturated and trans. Again, for trans, you're taking something that was not saturated and you forced the hydrogens on there, but you still have a double bond. So it has just the same amount of hydrogens as something that is saturated, but it also has a double bond. So it makes it almost like a super saturated fat where it'll stack and be even more stable than a saturated food, which is why it is so detrimental to our health, right? So saturated, no double bonds, straight structure, solid at room temperature. Trans, you are going to have one or more double bonds in the transfiguration, which just means there's also hydrogens on there. And then our mono and polyunsaturated fats, you can see that they are kinked. When we think about saturated and trans, we really want to try to avoid eating them. When we think about our unsaturated, we want to try to eat them because they counteract each other. Okay, so I want to go back now. I want to talk about triglycerides. I want to talk about phospholipids, and I want to take a second to talk about sterols and just cholesterols. So we dove into our fatty acid tails, which are going to be in all of them, but now we're going to kind of go up the ladder to that concept map and just look at our 3 different types of fatty acids. So triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols are going to be the 3 kinds. Again, remember that sterols don't exactly have fatty acids, but they're going to be more in a ring structure instead of a tail structure. So how we learn them, those hydrocarbon chains, they're not chains, they're going to be in a sterile configuration. So the defining feature of a triglyceride is those 3 fatty acid tails. They are going to be the type that you eat. They are the type that end up in your triglycerides. There is a glycerol head at the top of them, and all that is the 3-carbon alcohol that is the backbone of a triglyceride. Most of the lipids we eat and store are going to be triglycerides, which is why, again, they're so complicated. Phospholipids are just going to be, the building blocks of a membrane. All triglycerides are still going to provide 9 kilocalories per gram. They're still fats, they're still lipids. I'm just talking about the different kinds. So you can see that here we have a glycerol head, we have the 3 fatty acid tails, many times they're of different lengths. So this is what the molecule is going to look like. Phospholipids, in contrast, are going to have the glycerol backbone, but they are only going to have the 2 fatty acid tails and then the phosphate head. They are soluble in fat and water because of how the head and the tails are going to be hydrophobic and hydrophilic. They are absolutely critical to every component of a cell membrane. Again, if we don't eat them, if we don't get them, then we aren't able to maintain our structures of our body. They are manufactured, so they're not exactly essential, but we do get them from our triglycerides. So our body can make phospholipids from our triglycerides, but if we don't eat triglycerides, we can't make phospholipids. Specifically, they are going to be found in peanuts, egg yolks, and salad dressings. Anything that's going to act as an emulsifier. So if you've ever made a salad before, or salad dressing, or maybe even peanut butter, if something emulsifies on its own, you know that it's going to have a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic component that is going to bind the emulsion together. So if you're interested in culinary science, that is why a lot of salad dressings are made with egg yolks because of the philic and phobic nature of the molecule. You can see here in a different way how they are orienting in a cell membrane. So we have the heads, the hydrophilic component is sticking out, and then we have the phobic tails that are going to be oriented away from the water, pointing to each other. All right, so we talked about triglycerides, we talked about phospholipids. Now we're going to talk about sterols. So all they are multiple rings of carbon atoms. So in a way that we saw the hydrocarbon chains, instead of it being a chain, they're just a ring. But they're the same thing. They're just in rings. Because they're in rings, they're going to act differently. Many sterols that we find in the human body are going to be essential hormones. So not only are they components of cell membrane sometimes, and they kind of provide structure to the cell membrane, but they also are going to be moving around. Remember, a hormone is going to be a chemical messenger of the endocrine system. Endocrine meaning inside. When I'm talking about inside my body, I'm talking about my cardiovascular system. They are also manufactured from triglycerides. So they are not an essential component of our diet. These also include cholesterol. So cholesterol is listed on our nutrition label. We still don't really know how much of our dietary cholesterol impacts the cholesterol in our human body. So it's a good thing to talk about that now, because you can see that they're not essential to eat for us to make. And so, it's going to have a huge genetic component, how your body makes and processes cholesterol or processes sterols. Everyone is a little bit different. And so, we really can't shame someone, if they have high cholesterol. Yes, there's things they can do maybe to their diet or to their lifestyle, but there are going to be components to that are outside of their control, unfortunately.